Welcome to the FRCL Weekly Call. We're a group of distribution leads who get together regularly to discuss works in progress, share ideas, and create opportunities for cross-distro collaboration.
All right. Hi, everybody. It is the 14th of January, 2026. We are leads of the Fedora RHEL and CentOS distributions, and we are gathered here today, as we have done many times in the past, to talk about things that are happening inside our communities that might be of interest, mutual interest between distributions, because we all recognize that things that happen in one generally have an effect on another. So today we are recording, and we are expecting that this recording is going to be published. And so, as always, you are welcome to take the content of what we talk about here back to your communities and discuss things, make plans, etc. Everything that we talk about here is public. So we are starting off the year with an interesting topic that people have asked for, and it's not exactly going to be everything that you asked for, but the topic of the week is the RHEL schedule. And the reality is that the RHEL schedule evolves over time, and there are some things that we can share, some things that we can't. What I'll be sharing with you today is the current is kind of the architecture for the schedule that we're largely operating against right now. Some of the details are a little bit different. This presentation is from 2021-ish, and so you'll see a few artifacts that aren't relevant any longer, like we don't have an alpha release or a minor release beta. But that's the general idea. So we're going to do a little bit of time. I'll share the schedule and do Q&A. We can discuss. We have a few people here that can add some additional clarity. In some cases, we have, for instance, Brian Stinson, who is kind of the engineering lead for RHEL these days, and Scott McCarty, who is the RHEL 11 product manager, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I'm going to share a Chrome tab, and you're going to go, oh man, Brendan, you really are a product of the 80s. If you have not lived in the 80s, or were not a child in the 80s, you probably don't know about the Choose Your Own Adventure books. They were a book where you would read a few pages, and you had to make a choice and tell you which page to go to. And this presentation is interactive in that same kind of way. So going back in time, in 2019, Brian, you read those backwards, that's crazy. Okay, going back in 2019, Red Hat made a major change in the way that we were doing releases. Prior to then, our schedule was very dynamic in the worst possible way, which is to say that we never knew when the next release was going to come out. Like we had to look at all of our partner launch schedules and like pick the date that seemed to be the sweet spot. And in 2019 at Red Hat Summit, when we launched RHEL 8, we announced that we were going to move to a new schedule where it was just a clockwork schedule. Every 6 months, we were going to make a new release. And our first attempt at that was hard to operate against. So it went like this. There was something like 10 weeks of this thing we call the planning phase. And then we did some development for a little bit, and then we did an internal snapshot, and we did some composing and verifying and shipping of bits to partners. And then there was a feature freeze. And then 2 weeks later, we would do a little bit more development on bug fixes. And then there was a bug freeze. We do another snapshot. And then we started doing external snapshots. So going to a kind of a wider variety of partners and so on and so forth. And then when we got really close to shipment, we would like create an RC and then do a bunch of verification, start working on 0 days, and then we would ship it. And as you can see, like each one of these lines represents a week, right? So there's 26, there's 52-ish weeks in a year. So a release every 6 months is every 26 weeks. So it looks something like this. And then if you think about it, like, you know, there's also, because we're like going negative here, there's also some overlap. Like some of the things that we're doing during that planning phase is also the same time that we're doing the final preparation for launch. So many of the activities over here are also taking place over here. And vice versa. So people are planning while they're trying to conclude their release. We're branching. Everything is in chaos, and we have like synchronization issues between our current release and then the next one. And then on top of that, we were working on launching. We had 2 major releases that were in development at any given moment, right? And so we had a 3-month offset. And so can you imagine, like, I feel badly for everyone who was involved in RHEL at this time, like trying to know what their priority was on any given day. Like, do I need to focus on the internal snapshot for RHEL 7 or the external snapshot 2 for RHEL 8? Am I allowed to check something in? Like, there were a lot of details that you needed to know in the course of the day. None of the tooling was helping. And so that was the environment in which RHEL was being generated up for the couple of years after 2019. So that was the schedule. And there were a lot of issues with that. And I'm going to call out a couple of them. And if people want to like go in deeper on any of those things, just a few of the things to really call out are beyond just the chaos of knowing what priorities were. The schedule was so heavy on the verification side that there was almost no time to actually develop new code. And in fact, when we made a beta release, according to our stats, about 40% of all changes went in after beta. So beta wasn't feature complete. Like nothing was fit for purpose. And so we looked at that and we decided, let's actually synchronize the schedule. Let's re-architect it. So the idea was, let's start from the ground up and actually build the thing that we need. And what I came up with is we need a much bigger period of time between the start of development and when we do a beta release. Again, we don't do beta releases any longer because CentOS Stream has become a thing. At this point in time, CentOS Stream was basically just a public snapshot of internal development. We weren't actually like doing the source Git workflow that we do today. And let's cut down the number of test cycles so that we just have a few really meaningful test cycles, and then we actually are continuously verifying our changes as we make them. There's still this alpha release. It died out pretty quickly. And then instead of having a separate feature freeze and bug freeze, we just have an all freeze at beta. This is no longer relevant either. And of course, there is still that overlap. So there's this period of time. Yeah, Brian, thank you. We don't do minor release betas any longer. There's still going to be a RHEL 11 beta. Major release betas are a thing. When CentOS Stream 11 comes out, there will be a period of time where that is being worked on, and then you'll eventually see a RHEL 11 beta, I believe. Scott, do you have any changes planned there?
Well, this is a tougher question to answer than, are there any specific changes?
Cool. Well, we will come back to that later then. But in any case, the general idea was, let's have about 16 weeks of time where we can do development instead of like the 8 that we had before. And let's have about 10 weeks of time where we refine things and branch off. Since this time, we have gotten rid of the minor release beta, and the schedule has been updated some. So this is not the current reality. The current reality is a little different, and it's probably one of those details that we don't want to go too deep into. But when we lined it up, this is what it looked like with the new schedule. So this started out with 9 alpha, which turns out alpha releases for major releases are not useful at all. But this is the way it worked, and this was a lot simpler for people to understand and prioritize their work on. I'll just add one extra thing. One of the fundamental principles that we wanted to have was that people could always check in code as long as development and QE agreed on something, on its validity. And Aleksandra, go ahead.
I have a maybe slightly off-topic comment, but I think it's important for people if they're like watching this without previous context. It's like if you can show the picture back again. It's like it's important to mention that it's not that we're doing development for 16 weeks and only after that we for the first time build the content which we have in development. Like packages are built continuously and updated continuously during that period. So there is no like one specific moment when we say, and now we built the role distribution. And it kind of creates a lot of misunderstandings in some places. So I wanted to just call it out explicitly. Like development means landing new package builds in the nightly repository all the time. And this is a continuous process which happens throughout this entire cycle.
Yeah. In fact, let me add a little bit to that. So if you haven't been around for the last 10 years, you probably, or even if you have, you might not have noticed, but there was this thing that we were talking about a lot in the mid 20-teens, which was always ready RHEL. And Aleksandra was one of the people who worked on that. Steph was kind of the spearhead for it. And the idea was that we should have a development practice that would allow us on any given moment to just snap a line and release the distribution as it is right then and there. And so everything that we're talking about here is like the when changes go in, phases of development, that kind of thing. But the underlying engineering workflow is such that you make changes in your dist-git and you do a build, and then verification takes place. And then once it is verified, it actually makes it into a compose that is the compose that you would snap from. So there are a few oddities in that, because sometimes you have a series of changes that go into a single package, and some of them are verified and some of them aren't, but you can't like separate those out. But plus or minus that, all of the things that you've seen in Fedora for like Fedora CI, for the GitLab workflow that is visible for CentOS Stream, all of that is toward that greater goal of having a continuously stable release. So none of that is showing up here. Like this isn't developer workflow. This is just like developer constraints. Okay, so I have a lot of other buttons I can click here. And for the people who wanted to know about the schedule, I'd like to ask, do you have questions about this? Or do you want us to go into anything or comments? So go ahead, click the raise your hand button, and we will go from there. Neal.
How do you pick ITMs?
All right, let's look at that. All right, so let me talk about ITMs for a minute. So the basic, one of the problems that we were having as a product development organization is predictability. We weren't sure when changes were going to land. And what would happen is we would get like a request to make 100 changes, like an individual engineer would get a request for 100 changes, and they knew that they could get about 50 of them done. But their intent was to get as many done as possible. And so their focus was on doing as much as they could and largely letting our upstream first policy dictate what was going to land in time. And this was in aggregate good, but from a business perspective, it's not good to have no predictability. You want to have some amount, but sometimes you can't predict what's going to happen upstream. Even so, you know that some things are more likely to land than others. And so ITM is short for Internal Target Milestone. And the basic idea behind an Internal Target Milestone was, I think I'll probably be able to get it done by this point in time. And that was, even if you were wrong half of the time, even being right half of the time was still way more signal than we had previously. And so the theory for development was, if you want to make a change, you have to put in an internal target milestone somewhere in that 26-week spread when you think the work will be done. And done meant not just committed, but also verified. So setting an ITM meant saying, development and QE have discussed this, and we think that we will be able to fully land this by this date. And it was kind of a precursor to us doing Scrum. As you know, we're adopting Scrum inside RHEL right now, but this was a before time thing when we just needed to have some form of predictability. So picking ITMs went like this. When we're doing development for RHEL, there's a period of time where any pair of developer and QEs can make a change in their technology area. But there's also a period of time where it's late enough in the release cycle that we needed to have administrative oversight to ensure that the change they wanted to introduce wouldn't have a cascade effect elsewhere into the distribution that couldn't be managed or caught by things like our CI systems. And so the question was, hey, how do I even choose a good deadline? And the answer was, well, let's try to put the highest risk work at the beginning of the cycle and the lowest risk work at the end of the cycle. That's not always practical. You don't necessarily know what the risk profile for each given change is, but to the extent that you can, you try to do it that way, because it's not like upstream is going to prioritize the high risk stuff early and the low risk stuff late. They're going to do things in the order that it gets done in. But that was the general idea. So when we started to have these internal target milestones attached to every BZ, again, we were in Bugzilla at the time, what we could see was that there was a big cluster of ITMs really late in the cycle. And then we could say, hey, you have this really unrealistic set of estimates here. What do you think is actually going to happen? And then we could revise this. So a good distribution would look something like this. And a bad distribution would move further to the right. And an ugly distribution would move further to the right further still, because at this point, you're actually planning to need that oversight. You're actually planning to need to make disruptive changes after a release is supposed to be feature complete. So this is what, this is literally the stuff that we were showing engineers for how to manage their ITMs. And this is what a good distribution looked like over the course of multiple cycles. The idea was, hey, don't target your work at beta. You should be planning your next release. You should be tending to any upstream duties that you've had to neglect, that kind of thing. So that is the theory, but I bet you have a follow-up question about this.
Well, I guess you'd be kind of right. So the follow-up question to this is from someone on the outside coming in, trying to figure out, for planning a contribution to be reviewed and to potentially land in time for the next RHEL minor. Because, I mean, realistically, that's what I care about as an EPEL person. What is there a reasonable window that can be extrapolated for each RHEL minor cycle that can be used as a guideline for, like, hey, if you need something to be done in time for this, to be available in that EPEL so that you can build your packages or make your software work for that next RHEL minor, is there a reasonable window that can be communicated for that to work for the development of each RHEL minor release?
So I will answer that. And Brian, I'm going to ask you for your answer on this as well, because I have an opinion that is dated. And Brian, I think your opinion is going to be more weighty. So basically, two pieces. The first is that clearly at the beginning of the release cycle is way better than at the end of the release cycle. And you know when the beginning of the release cycle is because we just made a release. So it's also the case that because teams are doing Scrum, they're actually making decisions on on a pretty cyclic basis. Like the maximum Scrum window is 4 weeks for teams, and most of them are doing 2-week sprints. And that means that if you're like in week 9 and you put in a request, they're probably going to have evaluated it at least by week 11. That doesn't mean that they're going to say yes. In fact, what it actually means is that they'd be like, oh man, we've got all this stuff that we haven't finished yet, and now we've got this extra request from Neal. How do we prioritize this? Neal's thing is really awesome, but it's also kind of risky. They're probably going to want to push it into the next cycle. So the basic rule of the road here is that earlier is definitely better. And Brian, I want to see if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would add is the reason we can't give that kind of answer is because it also depends on the component also, because each component is going to have its kind of its own little flavor of what the responsible team wants to target. So you see these 2 test cycles here on the screen. Like some of them, it's really important for us to have 2 full integrative test cycles done on those components. Some of them are a little more open to to accepting changes later in the process because either they're smaller in scope or it's easier to test, things like that. And so giving a date window that says if you land any change into RHEL between this date and this date and you'll make it into the release, like that's really hard to calculate across the 2,000 components because they all operate a little bit differently. And so like having it, again, one of the things that we've been trying to encourage, and we're still getting better at this, but it's not something that we are perfect at by any means, but this has to be a conversation with the team that maintains the components, and responsiveness and things like that are something that we do care about. So having those conversations is the easiest way to start to talk about an individual change and how much that's going to affect what makes it into a release or even a particular build.
Yeah. Oh, this reminds me, I should add one more evolution since this was made. Back at the time that the schedule was designed, we had this theory that we should minimize 0 days, and therefore changes were either going to be targeted at the install media, or they're going to be like in the first Z-stream batch, the first support update batch post-release. And since that time, we've gotten a lot more flexible on what can actually happen in this later period afterward, and that includes, like, we've delegated a lot of decision making instead of it being at a central body where like Brian, a member of support, and a member of quality engineering are making a choice on what can go in or not. It's actually delegated at the product owner level, and so we are very much moving decision making down the stack. So the dialogue with the team is it's the most fundamental thing. It is way more accurate than anything you'll ever get out of the schedule itself. Pat, go ahead.
All right. I have a tacitly naggy bit. So in the past, the way in which we interacted with these cycles was open a Bugzilla. So I opened a Bugzilla, and then it was open a support ticket. So I opened a support ticket. Then it was open a Jira. So I opened a Jira. And then it was open a support ticket, and then they will open a Jira. So I would open a support ticket, and then they would open a Jira. What workflow do you want me to use outside of the Red Hat firewall to, I have this patch, I got it in upstream, it fixes this bug, that's the whole reason I wrote the patch. How do I get this onto an ITM?
Okay. There's definitely been evolution over time. And Brian, if you want to chime in on this as well, I'll just say that creating a support ticket is generally something that we would expect you to do as a customer. As a community member, a Jira ticket is the correct interface. There's also GitLab. Brian, what is the current answer actually?
Yeah, I think so. A Jira is definitely the sort of the barrier to entry here, and we will we will take Jiras and prioritize them along with as teams go through the regular process of refining those items and stuff. If you are a customer, attaching a support ticket to a Jira is one way that we sort of gauge impact also. So, it factors into the prioritization discussion in a number of different ways, but if you are a Red Hat customer, filing a support ticket and attaching it, just so that we know who all is affected in that space, that's really important too. And then, Pat, you're a pretty smart guy. Like, you know how to do to merge requests as well. Those are always welcome. But again, like, starting the conversation is the important part, and the Jira is how to get that sort of kicked off. And I think by now we've basically kind of taken out some of the old cruft of that time when we were in the half Bugzilla, half Jira space, and that caused a lot of weird workflow recommendations from support and things like that, just to deal with kind of having the feet in both camps there. So start with opening a Jira is my suggestion.
Yeah, it feels like we should probably have this documented if we don't. And if we do, we probably need to make it more prominent. And if it's out of date, we should definitely update it. Okay, Yaakov, go ahead.
So I think one thing we could emphasize is that there's a difference between simply making a request that the team will have to fulfill and coming with a merge request. I'm the kind of guy that would much rather file a patch than a bug. If I can find a patch something, generally I will. If I want something or somebody else wants something in well, that's what CentOS Stream is supposed to be for, right? CentOS Stream is there, so technically anyone can contribute to the next RHEL miner. And so, if somebody's coming with the merge request, I mean, they file Jira because the process requires a Jira ticket, and then they're filing a merge request to go with it. The bar should be a little lower. I mean, yes, the team still needs to be able to agree that they can review the change and agree that they can support it for the duration of the RHEL major, but we're asking a lot less suddenly, right? So as an outsider, and although I work for Red Hat, I'm not a RHEL maintainer of any particular package because my role is different. Technically, from all intents and purposes, I'm an outsider as far as any particular package after it branches is concerned. Still, I know we can't make promises and whatever else. At the end of the day, if we want to get something into, say, RHEL 10.2, right? It's kind of hard to do that if you don't know when you should be doing that. But it's nice to say early as possible, but at some point, that's not always possible. Earlier than and there should be some way we can express some sort of idea of, like, hey, if you want to get things, if you want to have a chance of getting things into 10.2, then, and especially if you're coming with it, if you just make a request, make the request early. If you're coming with it, if you're actually contributing a change, you're filing a merge request yourself, you're doing the work, and you want the team to review and assess it, then, like anything, there should be some way we can express some sort of deadline that do that. Without that, right, everything we're saying so far is very vague, and frankly, I don't know how anybody outside of Red Hat would be able to take anything from it.
The answer is that we just kind of throw our hands in the air and hope and dance a little and hope for the best, because there's not really anything else we can do.
Well, why don't we suggest an alternative? So if you wanted to get something done, like in a change made in a Fedora package where like proven packager status isn't applicable, you would just go and you would talk to the person that was actually responsible, right? You would have a conversation. And I think one of the issues we have evolved over time is this sense that there's an over-the-wall between RHEL and CentOS Stream and Fedora, and that, I don't know, maybe in the early days it was intentional. It's not intentional these days. And so those same sorts of behaviors you would do to engage with a community member are the kinds of behaviors I'd expect you to do with a RHEL maintainer. So you can't necessarily always get what you want. They might be on vacation. Their package might be going a different direction. Who knows? But you have to have the conversation. I think that's the biggest takeaway is like, don't just throw things over the wall and hope for the best. That's the minimum you can do. But if you just go a little bit further and try to have a conversation, that's going to do 90% of what you could get by like using insider contacts or something. Like it's really like we're the same people that are working in Fedora. We're just doing it with a different source tree. So like, talk to us like you would for any other thing. You'll get the kinds of results you would get in any other place. Amy, go ahead.
Yes, I'm going to go back a little bit in the conversation to Pat. So remember that when we met last year at Red Hat Summit, we found out that there's actually two different ways and two different systems of putting in tickets, that community ones weren't necessarily handled the same as customer ones, which is kind of the point that's been made earlier in this conversation before I put my hand up or after I put my hand up. So you mentioned better documentation. Can we get documentation on how and where to actually submit things? Because we also had this conversation related to OpenStack where, because of a tag they put on the ticket, the security policies came into effect and no one could see things. So even best practices of how to tag your ticket so it will remain visible and everyone can see it and be more community.
Amy, who would you say you're directing your question at?
Everyone in general.
Okay.
Remember, I am a Red Hatter, but I am not on the RHEL team. So I come to things, basically with an outsider point because I can't see those tickets. I'm not in engineering. Mm-hmm. So if something's tagged wrong, even I can't see it. So in some sense, I see things just like the community members do. Okay.
So if you were just any random community member, I would totally say, oh, you should go talk to the CentOS board. In fact, talk to Amy. She's like, you should take that question to her because she should be able to answer it. And if you're having the question, like something has gone wrong, right? So a few basic facts that I think everyone should know that probably not everybody knows. So RHEL development used to be in Bugzilla, and now it's in Jira. Red Hat's been using Jira since we acquired JBoss in like 2000, not much. And all the issues that were in Bugzilla by default were open to the whole world to see. Now that we're in Jira, that hasn't changed. Like anyone can create a Jira account. Anyone can look at the issues that are in the RHEL project. Ones that are marked as confidential, you're not going to see, but that's the same as it was in Bugzilla. So the thing that you see in Jira at issues.redhat.com in the RHEL project, those are the live issues that we're all working with. And so when you create a RHEL issue and you set the component, whatever the component is that your request is for, that's the thing that engineering is working with. And it's like that's the live place where we're doing planning, where we're doing prioritization, where we're having conversations. Eventually, if that work gets picked up and there's an MR request, it gets linked to a GitLab issue, which generally also is publicly visible. So like none of these things have changed. Like the URL might have changed, but the access is the same. So if if we're missing documentation on where to go to create a issue for RHEL in the CentOS docs, we can probably fix that in the course of a day, because the facts are pretty simple and straightforward. Neal.
So you made a comment earlier that we're all that the people that are working on this stuff are all the same people that do this stuff in the Fedora space. But in my experience, that's actually not true. More often than not, the people that are the RHEL maintainers, I have never seen them before. I don't know who they are, and they don't participate in the Fedora space. And as a consequence, I don't actually know how to talk to them, and I don't know how to identify them. So like, if, one of the even bigger stumbling blocks, if we're talking about, okay, making a Jira, and then you have to have a conversation before making a patch, that is that we don't know how to have that conversation because there's nowhere to converse. We don't know how to find out who to converse. Like, outside of the RHEL kernel package, which has a document inside of its source tree that lists all the GitLab user IDs for all the people that are actually maintainers of all the different subsystems, this is not a thing in for the packages within CentOS Stream maintained by Red Hat. And even if those existed, they don't necessarily have a mapping to Fedora account system, which allows us to find out who they are on, say, Matrix or whatever, to be able to talk to them or figure out emails or whatever, because like that information is just not present. So like, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like, I have, for example, when we talked last month about the NVIDIA stuff and how driver support and things like that should be better, I made my patches that I worked on in Alma Linux. I sent them up to be upstream to the CentOS Stream, but I have no one to talk to because the people aren't present. Like, I just can't actually get anyone to look at anything.
So there's like lowercase p participant and then uppercase p participant. Neal, you are an uppercase p participant. Like, you're here, for heaven's sake. You're in the matrix. You're on discussion forums. You're on mailing lists. You're everywhere. Most of the people who maintain RHEL packages are also maintainers of Fedora packages, but that doesn't mean that they are quite as engaged of Fedora participants. They just manage the package itself, and they do what they have to keep it current and move the sources through the system and have it work. So it's two different levels. But
I am saying you're not even Fedora package maintainers. Like, for example, I found out that Captain my package in Fedora was imported into RHEL, and nobody talked to me, and nobody asked or offered to be a co-maintainer in Fedora. So like, I wound up being very surprised on that front.
Neal, I think you've got to like separate, as Brendan's saying, is like, your personal experience is very different than the full experience of any user of Fedora. Like, there is a user experience, and then there's like a light contributor experience, and then there's like a very heavy duty. You're proposing changes to the way the thing gets built, which is the maximum contribution. Like, I disagree.
Scott,
here's why. Can I finish?
Point.
But there's an important point here. I've been watching the Fedora change proposal emails for like 6 months. And I definitely agree with what Brendan said. The same people that build Fedora build RHEL. Like, when you look at who proposes the DNF changes and who proposes the glibc changes and who can propose the kernel changes, they're all the same people. So like, as a casual contributor, I would consider myself, you're more hardcore than me. I can kind of figure out who I need to go talk to figure out what's going on in Fedora. Now, if I wanted to change how Fedora fundamentally gets built, that's a different level of thing. Like, the way the NVIDIA example that you're bringing up is like fundamentally changing the way Fedora gets built. That's different. That's harder.
So in defense of Neal's point, there are definitely examples of situations where there's a different maintainer in Fedora than in RHEL. And sometimes there are, I think something like, Steve, I don't know if you have the stats up, but something like 30% of the packages that are included in RHEL 10 are community maintained in Fedora, but every package that's included in RHEL 10 is Red Hat or maintained. So there is a section. It's not the majority, but there is a section of packages where there is an engagement. And that's something I think a lot of us here who are community minded would like to address. And I think that feedback is worthwhile. But what do we do about it?
Yeah, that's fair.
That's the reality we're in. And so,
but that's the point I was talking about. Like, because there are cases, and I'm not saying this is like, oh, I'm everywhere kind of thing. I'm just saying this is like, the reason I found out was that somebody asked me to put Captain Proto into EPEL, and then I tried to trigger it, and it's like, you can't. This package is in RHEL, and I'm like, what? and that's what happened.
Hey, Troy's got his both hands up, virtual and physical. Go ahead, Troy, and then I want to do a follow-up.
Okay, this call is about schedule. I have a schedule question. And this is putting on my EPEL hat. And don't get me wrong, I think Neal's is good, but I do have a schedule question. I want to ask it.
Okay, in that case, can I just do one thing really quick?
Okay.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. So, Neal, when you do not know who the maintainer is, when you create an issue in Jira, it gets auto-assigned to the maintainer. So, while you might not know it at the beginning of creating an issue, if you set a component, you're going to know who it is at the end of creating that issue. So you always have the ability, you always have the option of getting an email address, often a person's name, certainly their Jira contact information, just by creating an issue. So I know it's not quite as nice as the experience you have with FAST, but it's there. So with that, Troy, please, 100%, it's all you.
Okay, there is a part in the release schedule. You said when we release, that's when it starts. That is not when it starts. You should know that. And Brian had a wonderful answer to that. Development starts at different times.
Yeah.
But there is one part, and that is the cutover. And that affects EPEL. That affects many maintainers that are waiting to pull all their stuff into the next thing. That is currently totally private. As a Red Hatter, I cannot mention when that is. Mm-hmm. What can we do for the outside? Because this part of the release schedule impacts a lot of outside people. What can we do?
Let me take the first half of that, and then I'm going to ask somebody else to provide a little more context for what the impact is. So once upon a time, in fact, at the time the schedule that I was showing you was written, there was a day where we branched all the packages. And then after that day, you knew, oh no, I've missed the branch date. And that means that the change is going to go here and not there. And I want it to go to both places. And there's all this exponential, or at least there's this doubling of work, right? We do not have a branch date any longer. The actual branching takes place at the discretion of the maintainer. There are days that we wouldn't branch early, but we do not have a consistent answer any longer.
That is not true. It's as a person who works in both CentOS and RHEL, there is a date when it goes from 10.1 to 10.2. And if you don't get it in that time, you do have more work to do.
You have a date where you are eligible to branch, but you don't have to.
You don't have to. I'm not talking about, okay, so, but the term is still the same. There is a time it goes from 10.1 to 10.2 or 2 to 3. And that affects a lot of people.
All right, I'm going to call on Brian, then Scott, and then I'm going to ask, what is the impact of that? So go ahead, Brian, then Scott.
Yeah, so there's, I think the reason, what you're asking for is like, when can I be certain that EPEL's going to be okay for the next minor release? Like that is the underlying question here.
That's
and
yes.
That, like there's a lot of reasons why we don't share a particular date of when that, source code cutover happens. There's a lot of factors that go into that. One of them being that it takes about a week to do all of the cutover process, and it depends on where the day falls, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So my suggestion about this has always been, like, we can do, you can do math based on the 6-month release schedule and pick a buffer that is reasonable for the project that consumes RHEL as a platform. So some projects like EPEL may be comfortable with a kind of a shorter window than someone who might be not as invested in the Red Hat ecosystem. They might want a longer window of when they consider something quote unquote baked. So we're not going to be in a situation where we can actually share a guaranteed date of source code cutover. But again, the cycle is a 6-month cycle every time. And I think consuming projects, you really need to pick a reasonable buffer before the 6-month release day to know that that something's coming, and that'll get you pretty good enough results. Mostly because things are going to be winding in towards the exception and blocker phase at that point, anyways. So I don't want to dictate that window for the projects that consume, but do math based on the 6-month release dates that we talk about.
I'm good with that answer. Thank you.
All right. So I just got a reminder that, hey, this call is only scheduled for an hour and we have just about 90 seconds left to go. So Scott took his hand down. Carl's got his hand up. Carl, you want to get the last word in here?
Yeah, no pressure, right? From the EPEL contributor side, what I'll point out is that with EPEL 10, we are doing minor versions that align a lot better with RHEL and CentOS itself. And while we don't have exact dates in there, like Brian was saying, like you can do math off the schedule. Like I'll expand on that a little, saying the same thing, is that you can pretty much look at months. And I think, it's not an exact day, but you can know that generally EPEL minor version mass branching, we've got one coming up in February that we're going to do. That's planned. There's public issues in my team stuff that we're tracking in Fedora Forge. And while that's not an exact day, maintainers know it's happening probably in February, give or take a week. And once it does happen, maintainers will have EPEL 10.2 branches that that they can work with, just like Fedora branching. So there's a lot of hints around when to do things. If you're waiting until February to make and the change you're trying to do in EPEL depends on something landing and knowing the exact day in February, you're probably doing it wrong, and refer back to the sooner is better thing. Like if you're waiting till February, understand that you might miss it and need to, and it's going to be in the next minor version.
Yeah, that was a perfect closeout, Carl. Thank you. So, hey, that was a really excellent discussion. I hope people learned some things today. I'm going to call it here. I'll see you again next week, where we'll talk about something different. We'll have the follow-up conversation about what we want to talk about in the Matrix chat. So I hope to see you there, and I will talk to y'all then, if not sooner. Bye all.
Bye.